Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Jax and here we are again, another talking through Speedpaint video. You guys really seem to get a lot out of the last one, so I think I might make these a more regular thing. I always find it helpful when artists talk through their processes, even when it's not a direct tutorial. Sometimes you pick up interesting bits and pieces that might help you with your own drawing process. And that's definitely the case here. I would like to point out at the beginning that this isn't really a dedicated scale tutorial. I will be talking through some of my techniques for painting scales in this particular piece, but honestly I don't really have any one consistent style for drawing scales at the moment. I feel like every time I've revisited this dragon character over the past 2 years, I've been experimenting with different methods to achieve a different aesthetic each time. That being said, I do actually quite like how the scales in this one turned out. I feel like with this piece my scale game has kind of leveled up a bit, and I'm quite pleased with the overall composition that I ended up getting. So if this style sticks and I keep using it in the future, then I might end up making a more in-depth tutorial later on. We shall see. In the meantime, enjoy this ride and I hope you'll find this process video informative and useful. Alright, so like I've been recently doing, I've decided to start this painting out in grayscale first before I added the colour. I mean, I already had a pretty good idea regarding the final colour palette, like it's a forest, there's water, it's gonna be pretty green and blue. But I thought it would be best to practice a bit more with what I've been learning and start out the process in black and white. And I realized throughout the painting, and especially when I did start to add colour later on, that this technique was actually really helpful for painting scales. And let me tell you why. Scales are an interesting texture to paint. They're often not entirely uniform in colour, and their surface sometimes tends to be a bit glossy or reflective, depending on what scaly animal you're looking at. As a result, the colour of scales you see can often vary a lot depending on the colour and lighting of the environmental surroundings. And I never like having scales that look too uniform anyway, but I found that when I went straight in with colour painting, I sometimes got some weird results. Like maybe in your case, you want your scales to be kind of yellowy green when the light hits it, but then have a cool toned shadow being cast by the scale on top of it. But then what happens if part of the body of the character falls into a different lighting condition, or the scales themselves change colour halfway across the character? Sometimes you have to kind of guesstimate how these colours will change consistently with those different conditions, and there would be a small range of colours you could choose from that would accurately convey the right property. And sometimes you can ballpark that colour, but sometimes your guesses fall drastically short. I've been on both sides of the spectrum, and let me tell you, recoloring individual scales after you realize the colour you picked isn't working is a giant pain in the butt. Which is why working in grayscale kind of solves some of these problems, and this way I could also focus on where I place the scales too and their different shapes and sizes. Which brings me to the brushes and techniques I use for painting these scales, and this technique is actually remarkably simple. If you've watched my first tutorial or the last video I made about going from black and white to colour, you'll know that my fundamental painting process is to start on a dark base, paint out the thing that sticks out, I guess, whether it's a tuft of fur, or in this case a scale, paint on the basic shape of the pointy end of the scale with a sharp watercolor brush. So I've set mine to about a min diameter of about 0, load color maybe like 90 to 100, and mixing of color low. And once you painted the shape of the general scale, switch to a big watercolor brush, say minimum diameter about 90, load color 50, mixing of color high. I think the Medibang has recently changed the name of these brush settings, but it's still basically the bottom two options at the bottom of any watercolor brush that you're using. And while still on the same lighter color that you chose, just do some big strokes to blend that scale into the color of the base. And the trick here is you want to start at the point of the body with the lowest scale. Like to make this technique easier, you always want to be creating the bottom scales first, so that all subsequent scales can just be layered on top of the one you've already painted. Some knowledge of general anatomy helps with things like placement and deciding the size and the shapes of the scales. Like the ones on the back can be quite broad, whereas once you go towards the limbs, there's less surface area and higher curvature, so you want the scales there to be relatively smaller. And that's all I'm going to be saying about the anatomy, because honestly my understanding is still quite basic. I just know enough to get me through a general drawing when I need it. Anyway, once you've laid down most of the scales, just sit back, let your hands rest a bit, give them a stretch to avoid any potential RSI problems. Look after your hands, kids, be kind to them. You never know, they might make you a living someday. And just look to see what areas of the body you think might be hit with a bit more light. the pointy ends of the scales at those parts might enjoy a little bit more glitz and highlight. This is basically your chance to add more contrast and dimensionality. You've laid down the basic texture of your dragon's armor, and now you get to decide which parts you want to emphasize. So for me, I wanted the back plates to jut out a bit, and there were areas on the shoulder where I thought, this part should have a different texture. So I used the same technique with a lighter, sharper brush, created a little bump on the shoulder and just blended those in with the base just to get a texture that's a bit different from the rest. Who doesn't like some spikes on their shoulder pads? It's fashion. This dragon, he a gangster. He likes his bling. Painting the scales on this guy pretty much took up half the time I spent working on this. It's definitely tedious, but at least once you get the technique down, it's pretty simple to do. You just have to have a bit of patience and maybe don't choose insanely small scales. Actually, if you do have a character with finer scales, just painting in blots of light on a darker base works pretty well too. Like, I definitely wouldn't, for the sake of my own sanity, try to replicate this technique to the same degree of detail for tiny scales, unless you want to go for, super realism, in which case, just make sure you reduce the amount of contrast between the base color and the scales that you lay on top of it. Don't go overboard with the contrast, otherwise it might look a bit weird. Or not, you do you. Honestly, I don't care. Alright, so once I had all the grayscale done, I was just raring to go with the color because you really needed it to bring this piece to life. I made quite a long video last week describing how I did this. It's pretty much the same process with this piece as well. So for each layer, I created a separate clipping layer, set it to overlay, and started filling out the painting with colors. I knew I wanted something super rainforesty, so dark, rich greens and blues were my main choices. After I was relatively happy with the base colors, I merged all the clipped overlay layers with the black and white layers underneath and started painting on top of them again. The thing with black and white is that it will make your colors look a bit washed out, especially if your values were pretty low in contrast to begin with, which mine were. So in this step, we can start adding in the pops of highlights that we were missing and just a bunch of little details like the grass, the mist, the little splashes from the waterfall to really bring the whole piece together. Oh, and also a deer. I really like adding these small touches to give the piece a sense of scale, a friend for Mr. Dragon to not eat. Actually, the original story with this particular character is that he protects this forest from any form of life that isn't plant-based. So any animal or human that goes wandering into his territory gets their soul sapped and their bodies returned to the earth to feed the forest. And then the dragon basically begins to develop some of the physical attributes of the animals they've taken. So yeah, I was a happy child. Anyway, we're done. This is the final piece, and I've got to say I'm really pleased with how this turned out. This is kind of my taking a break from work to draw something personally fun piece. Next week I'll be starting work on a fresh batch of commissioned paintings, which I'm really excited for, so stay tuned for those. Actually, prints of this drawing, along with a couple of others, are for sale on my Redbubble and imprint stores, so if you would like a hard copy of this painting, feel free to check those out. In the meantime, I hope this process video and my rambling commentary was somewhat helpful. Let me know what you think of the video in the comments below. Remember to leave a like, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications. I don't know, do the things YouTubers always tell you to do at the end of their videos, and I'll catch you all next time. Bye!